On a warm summer evening in early July 1950, Private Kenneth Shadrick sat in the back of a truck bouncing along a dirt road in South Korea. He was 20 years old, from Skin Fork, West Virginia, a coal mining town so small most Americans had never heard of it. He'd enlisted for steady pay and adventure, and now he was riding north with the other boys of Task Force Smith towards something the officers said would be over quickly. The North Koreans would see American troops and turn around. They'd all be back in Japan within a week. 3 days later, Kenneth Shadrick would become the first American soldier killed in the Korean War. Task Force Smith, 540 men sent to stop an army, would learn a lesson written in blood. Never send men to war unprepared, under-equipped, and overconfident. This is the story of America's rude awakening. To understand what happened to Task Force Smith, you need to understand what the American military had become after World War II. In August 1945, the United States had 12 million men and women in uniform, the most powerful military in human history. Within a year, that force had shrunk to 1.5 million. By 1950, barely over 1 million remained. The veterans who'd stormed beaches and fought through Europe went home. What replaced them was an army of occupation scattered across Japan and Germany, more concerned with garrison duty than combat readiness. In Japan, where the 8th Army was stationed, life was comfortable. American soldiers lived in converted barracks with movies, baseball leagues, clubs. The occupation duty was easy: administrative work, guard shifts, maintaining order in a country that wasn't fighting back. Training suffered. Units operated at 50% strength or less. Equipment was World War II surplus, stored in warehouses and deteriorating. Ammunition was rationed because budgets were tight. Live fire exercises were rare. Physical fitness standards slipped. The 24th Infantry Division in southern Japan was typical. Its soldiers were 18, 19, 20 years old. Many had joined for the paycheck and the overseas adventure. They did their jobs, pulled their shifts, and enjoyed what Japan had to offer. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Bradford Smith commanded the 1st Battalion, 21st Infantry Regiment. At 34, Smith was a World War II veteran. He knew his battalion wasn't ready for combat, but that was fine. There wasn't going to be any combat. Those days were over. The officers and NCOs who'd served in the war saw the readiness problems, but budgets were tight. You worked with what you had. Besides, who was going to fight the United States? The next war, if there ever was one, would be fought with missiles and bombers, not infantry. That was the comfortable lie everyone believed. At 4 a.m. on June 25, 1950, 90,000 soldiers of the North Korean People's Army crossed the 38th parallel and invaded South Korea. They came with T-34 tanks, Soviet-made, the same tanks that had driven to Berlin. They came with artillery that could pulverize defensive positions. They came with soldiers who'd trained for months, who'd fought with the Chinese Communists or Soviet forces in World War II. They had a plan, overwhelming force, and total surprise. The South Korean army collapsed within days. Seoul fell. North Korean forces rolled south with mechanical precision. President Harry Truman made the decision. The United States would intervene. General Douglas MacArthur, commanding American forces from Tokyo, was ordered to stop the North Korean advance. The problem was simple and terrifying. MacArthur didn't have much to work with. The nearest troops were the occupation divisions in Japan, not combat-ready, needing time to mobilize. But time was the one thing MacArthur didn't have. The North Koreans were advancing 20 to 30 miles a day. On June 30th, MacArthur flew to Korea and saw chaos. Roads clogged with refugees, South Korean soldiers retreating in disorder, North Korean forces brushing aside resistance. MacArthur made his decision: send a small force to Korea immediately. Not to stop the invasion, that was impossible, but to delay it, to show the North Koreans that Americans were in the fight. Maybe that would slow them down. He chose the 24th Division because it was closest to the ports. From that division, he chose the unit that could deploy fastest. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Bradford Smith's 1st Battalion, 21st Infantry. They called it Task Force Smith. On July 1, 1950, Lieutenant Colonel Smith received his orders. Take a reinforced rifle company to Korea immediately. Move north, contact the enemy, delay their advance. The orders were vague because intelligence was non-existent. Nobody knew how many North Koreans there were, what their capabilities were, where exactly they were. The assumption, the hope, was that American troops would make them hesitate. Smith selected Baker Company and Charlie Company, plus communications, recoilless rifle teams, and 2 4.2-inch mortars, 406 infantrymen. Behind them, 134 artillerymen with 6 105mm howitzers, 540 men total. Most had never been in combat, average age around 20. Some had been in the army less than 6 months. Their equipment was World War II surplus. M1 Garand rifles, Browning automatic rifles, a few bazookas, 2.36-inch rocket launchers that had worked against German tanks but were already obsolete. No armor, no tanks, just trucks and jeeps. Smith scrounged what he could: extra ammunition, rations, medical supplies. Within hours, Task Force Smith was packed into trucks, heading for Itazuki Air Base. On July 2nd, they boarded C-54 transport planes and flew to Korea. Many soldiers were excited. This was adventure. The officers said it wouldn't be bad. Show the flag, fire a few shots, the North Koreans would back off. Private Kenneth Shadrick wrote his mother before takeoff, "Don't worry, I'll be fine. I'll be home soon." They landed at Osan in the afternoon. The heat was oppressive, humid, soaking through uniforms in minutes. They loaded onto trucks and drove north. Korea was beautiful and terrifying. Mountains covered in green, narrow, winding roads, refugees everywhere, families carrying everything they owned, children crying, desperation in every face. Task Force Smith drove north through the chaos. They passed retreating South Korean soldiers, shattered units trying to regroup. Nobody knew where the North Koreans were. Somewhere north, getting closer. On July 4th, Independence Day, they reached Pyeongtaek, 60 miles south of Seoul. The intelligence wasn't good. North Koreans coming down Highway 1 with tanks and infantry, lots of them. Soon, Smith drove north, looking for defensive ground. He found it 3 miles north of Osan, low hills where the highway passed through. Good observation. Open rice paddies flanking the road. The hills gave cover and elevation. Not ideal, but nothing about this was ideal. On the morning of July 5th, Task Force Smith dug in. Positions on hills flanking the highway. Mortars behind the ridgeline. Recoilless rifles covering the road. Riflemen in foxholes. Communications wire laid. Anti-tank weapons positioned. Then they waited. It rained. Cold rain turning dust to mud. Men sat in foxholes, watching north, smoking, trying to stay dry. Some were scared. Most were wet and uncomfortable, wondering how long they'd be out here. Smith walked the line, checking positions, talking to his men. He tried to project confidence. Inside, he was worried. 400 men with almost no anti-tank capability against an army with tanks. The bazookas were nearly worthless against T-34s. The recoilless rifles might work with luck. The mortars could harass but not stop armor. Orders were orders. Hold as long as possible. Delay the enemy. Buy time. At dawn on July 5th, through rain and mist, they saw movement. 8 T-34 tanks appeared through the grey morning, moving single file down Highway 1, engines rumbling, treads clanking. The men of Task Force Smith had never seen enemy tanks before. Now they watched 30 tons of Soviet steel, each mounting an 85mm gun, rolling toward them. Smith watched through binoculars. Behind the first 8 tanks, more were coming. Behind the tanks, trucks, infantry. 33 tanks would pass through that day. This was the main force. He gave the order, hold fire until they're in range. Let them close. At approximately 4,000 yards from the infantry positions, The artillery battery 2 miles to the rear opened fire. Shells arced overhead toward the advancing column. Direct hits, but the tanks kept coming. The tanks rolled closer. 2,000 yards, 1,000 yards, 700 yards. Now, Smith gave the order. The recoilless rifles fired. Bazooka teams ran forward for shots. The battle was fully joined. The first rounds hit. Explosions against the lead tank's armor. Smoke and fire. For a moment, Task Force Smith thought they'd stopped it. The smoke cleared. The tank kept coming. The T-34's armor was too thick. Bazookas barely scratched it. Recoilless rifle rounds ricocheted off. Nothing stopped them. The tanks drove straight through the American position, firing 85mm guns and machine guns. The noise was overwhelming. Engines roaring, tank guns cracking, machine guns rattling. Explosions walked across the hillside. Men died in their foxholes, cut down by machine gun fire, or blown apart by high explosives. Medics couldn't reach the wounded without being shot. The tanks rolled past, through, and behind the position, cutting Task Force Smith off from their supply vehicles. Then the infantry arrived, trucks loaded with North Korean soldiers, hundreds of them. They deployed in good order, took positions, began a coordinated assault. These weren't poorly trained conscripts. These were professionals. Many had fought with the Chinese communists. They moved with discipline, used cover effectively, laid down suppressive fire while others maneuvered. The battle became desperate close-range fighting. North Korean infantry attacked from the front. Tanks that had passed through turned around and fired from the rear. Task Force Smith was surrounded, taking casualties from all directions. Private Kenneth Shadrick was firing his rifle near the road. He'd spotted a North Korean machine gun nest and was trying to suppress it. As he leaned out for another shot, a burst of machine gun fire caught him in the chest. He died within minutes. The first American soldier killed in the Korean War, 20 years old, in Korea 3 days. The fighting continued for hours. Americans held positions, poured fire into attacking infantry, called for artillery support from a battery of 105mm howitzers miles to the rear. The howitzers fired over 3,000 rounds, but it wasn't enough. By mid-morning, the situation was desperate. Heavy casualties, low on ammunition, mortars nearly empty, recoilless rifles abandoned or destroyed, more North Korean troops arriving, fresh units deploying, maneuvering to complete the encirclement. Lieutenant Colonel Smith made the call, withdraw or be annihilated. The retreat began in chaos. Units that could move pulled back under fire, carrying wounded when possible, leaving dead where they fell. North Koreans pressed the attack. Men stumbled through rice paddies and over hills toward the assembly point miles south. Some units maintained cohesion, others scattered, small groups just trying to survive. The wounded were the worst problem. Carrying men with chest wounds, shattered legs, abdominal injuries through rough terrain under fire was nearly impossible. Some soldiers stayed with wounded friends, knowing it probably meant capture or death. Others made the terrible calculation that survival meant leaving buddies behind. The North Koreans captured over 100 American soldiers, the wounded who couldn't walk, soldiers cut off, men out of ammunition with nowhere to go. Some ended up in POW camps, others were never seen again. Captain Richard Dashner later described it. Every man for himself. We'd lost all unit cohesion. Men scattered everywhere, trying to get south. North Koreans shooting at anything that moved. I saw men I knew lying in rice paddies, dead or dying, and there was nothing we could do. The artillery battery had its own disaster. When the infantry position was overrun, North Korean tanks turned on the howitzers. Artillerymen fought until tanks were on top of them, losing 5 of 6 guns and over half their men before withdrawing. By nightfall, survivors straggled south to Chonan and tried to regroup. The count of 540 men 185 were casualties, 60 killed, 21 wounded who made it out, and 82 captured or missing. All heavy weapons lost: mortars, recoilless rifles, most machine guns. Many soldiers had thrown away their rifles. Task Force Smith had fought for over 6 hours. They had delayed the North Korean advance, bought precious time, but the cost was devastating, and they had been swept aside. In the following days, survivors were pulled back to reorganize. New soldiers filled the gaps. Equipment was replaced. The battalion was rebuilt. But something had broken that couldn't be fixed with new gear. Every man who'd been there knew the truth. America had sent them to war unprepared. The North Korean army wasn't backing down because Americans showed up. They had modern Soviet equipment, professional soldiers, and the will to fight. The comfortable assumptions that American technological superiority would be enough, that the enemy would be poorly trained, that a show of force would end it, all died on that hillside. The disaster sent shockwaves through the American military. General MacArthur realized he'd badly miscalculated. The 24th Division would face the same forces with the same inadequate preparation. Over the next weeks, the North Korean advance continued. American and South Korean forces fought, delaying actions, trading space for time, retreating south. The 24th Division took terrible casualties. The perimeter around Osan grew smaller. It would take months to stabilize. The Incheon landing in September turned the tide. But those months of desperate fighting cost thousands of American lives, much of it traceable to the decisions that created Task Force Smith. In Washington, the Pentagon investigated. How had this happened? How had American soldiers been sent to fight tanks with weapons that couldn't penetrate tank armor? Why were troops so poorly trained? Why was equipment so outdated? The answers were uncomfortable. After World War II, America enjoyed peace and prosperity. Defense budgets were slashed. The military deteriorated. Training was sacrificed for cost savings. Equipment modernization was delayed. The assumption was that atomic bombs made conventional forces less important. Nobody planned for a conventional war in Korea. Task Force Smith became a case study, taught at West Point, the Army War College, every level of military education. The lesson: never again. Never send troops unprepared. Never assume the enemy will be weak. Never let peacetime complacency hollow out the force. Never forget that when politicians fail to prepare, soldiers pay in blood. After the war, survivors of Task Force Smith scattered. They went home, got jobs, started families. Most didn't talk about that rainy July morning. How do you explain facing tanks with weapons that didn't work? How do you describe watching friends die because your country didn't give you what you needed? Lieutenant Colonel Charles Bradford Smith continued his career. He wasn't blamed. Everyone recognized he'd been given an impossible mission, but the memory stayed with him. In later interviews, his voice would change when he talked about Task Force Smith. The regret, the anger, the sorrow, still there. Many soldiers captured on July 5th spent years in North Korean POW camps. Brutal conditions. Men died of starvation, disease, exposure, abuse. Some were tortured. When they came home after the armistice in 1953, they were shadows of the young men who'd boarded those transports. Private Kenneth Shadrick never came home. His body was recovered and returned to Skin Fork, West Virginia. He was buried in a small cemetery overlooking the mountains where he'd grown up. For his family, for that tiny town, the Korean War was the day Kenny didn't come home. There's a memorial now where Task Force Smith made its stand, a stone marker beside Highway 1, north of Osan. South Korean and American flags fly there. Each anniversary, ceremonies are held. Veterans gather to remember. The inscription is simple: in memory of the soldiers of Task Force Smith who fought here on July 5, 1950, in the first ground combat action of the Korean War. It doesn't mention they were unprepared. It doesn't mention inadequate weapons. It doesn't mention the 150 casualties, the captured, the dead left behind. But the men who were there remember, and soldiers who study military history remember. Task Force Smith stands as a permanent reminder of what happens when nations fail to prepare for war, when budget cuts and peacetime thinking leave soldiers vulnerable, when leaders make decisions based on wishful thinking instead of reality. Task Force Smith is not just about one battalion or one battle. It's about every time soldiers have been sent to war without the tools, training, or support they needed. It's about the gap between what politicians promise and what soldiers face. It's about the price of unpreparedness. In the decades since, the United States military has tried to internalize the lessons. Equipment is maintained, training is prioritized, units are kept ready. The hollow force of the post-World War II years has been replaced by a professional military that takes readiness seriously. But the temptation is always there. In peacetime, when budgets are tight, there's pressure to cut military spending, to reduce training, to delay equipment purchases, to assume the next war won't happen. Task Force Smith tells us what happens when we give in to that temptation. 406 infantrymen and 134 artillerymen were sent to stop an army. They fought with courage. They held their position until holding it meant dying for nothing. They bought time, paid for with 185 casualties. When it was over, when survivors stumbled south through rain and mud, they carried a lesson written in blood. Courage is not enough. Soldiers need tools to fight. They need training to survive. They need leaders who will send them to war only when necessary and who will give them what they need to win. Private Kenneth Shadrick, 20 years old, from Skin Fork, West Virginia, died on a hillside in Korea because his country was unprepared. He wasn't the last. Over 3 years, 36,000 more Americans would die, many in those desperate first months, when units thrown into combat unprepared tried to hold back an enemy they'd been told wouldn't fight. The memorial beside Highway 1 stands as a reminder, not just of July 5, 1950, but of what can happen when we forget that peace must be guarded, that freedom requires sacrifice, and that soldiers who defend both deserve the means to do their job. Task Force Smith was the rude awakening, the moment when America learned that comfortable peacetime assumptions have no place in war, the moment when soldiers paid the price for their nation's unpreparedness. We remember them. We honor their sacrifice. We carry forward the lesson they taught. Never again. Never send soldiers to war unprepared. Never assume the enemy will be weak. Never forget that the price of unreadiness is measured in lives. This was Task Force Smith. This was America's rude awakening.